Now today we're launching, or I'm launching, this little series of lectures on music and fairy tales. And in order to jump straight in on this topic, I thought we would travel back in time to one of the great events in television history in America. In fact, it was such a great event that they repeated it several times in 1955, 1956, and 1960, and did the whole thing from scratch, completely live on TV. It was, of course, Peter Pan with Mary Martin, broadcast live on NBC, and it was a massive event for families across America. And what we're going to see is actually rather a sad scene, or a potentially sad scene, in which poor old Tinkerbell has just absorbed some poison that's been left for Peter Pan, who was going to consume it and die. But so Tinkerbell decides to take the poison herself, and she arrives, and we are aware of her presence partly because of a light, but mainly because of the sound that we can hear. So let's take a look at this clip and listen very carefully to what's happening musically when Tinkerbell is communicating with Peter Pan.
What's the matter with you? It was poisoned. You drank it to save my life. Tink, dear Tink, you're dying. Your light is growing faint. And if it goes out, that means you're dead. Your voice is so low I can scarcely hear what you're saying. You think that it will take. That you could get well again if children believed in fairies. Do you believe? Oh, please, please believe. If you believe, wherever you are, clap your hands and she'll hear you. Clap! Clap! Don't let Tink die! Clap! She's getting better. Clap! Clap! Thank you!
I should have just played the whole thing and not bother with the lecture. Hey, next time. So those were the days. Imagine Mary Martin breaking the fourth wall, a highly unusual thing to do, really, on television in this period, and getting children across America to clap at their television screens. And the reason why we know that Tinkerbell is reviving is because we hear this sound, the Celesta, which is a particular keyboard instrument, and which we tend to associate in classical music with the dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy from the Nutcracker, which is the subject of my next Gresham lecture, as it happens. This moment in Peter Pan is a famous one, and it's associated in terms of J.M. Barrie with this question, do you believe in fairies, which tends to bring the idea of fairy tales as being something about faith and belief. And if you were the grumpy novelist E.M. Forster of Howard's End fame, then your response was a resounding no, not under any circumstances. He wouldn't have been clapping. At the other end of the spectrum, Carl Jung, of all people, and his followers believed that fairy tales were the purest and simplest expression of collective unconscious psychic processes. And this seems also extreme in the other direction, but we kind of know what they're getting at. It's this idea that fairy tales pervade our culture so much that if I say Sleeping Beauty to you, then you might think of an image a bit like this one. Princess Aurora, happily asleep with her white skin and her tiara and her perfect makeup. And we're so used to seeing these images that we never stop to ask intelligent questions like, if she's been asleep for 100 years, how is it that her parents are still alive at the end of the story? And by the way, who's going to, fix her makeup on a daily basis? Because 100 years is a long time to keep looking like that. But we don't think about it because we're so absorbed with these kinds of images. And this includes, of course, in the ballet, The Sleeping Beauty, with its Tchaikovsky score, which romanticizes this whole business with waltzes a bit like this one. I was about to play Mendelssohn then, that was bad. Okay, I should have printed this out. Oh, I can see it, here we go. And so on, and all the rest of it. So you see, being a Sleeping Beauty is apparently a great thing. Except if we really look at the story, is it really about Sleeping Beauty? She's almost like the object rather than the subject of this story, especially when the prince comes along, because he suddenly gets all of the action and does this slightly dodgy business of kissing her awake. And many other artists have reconceived now this story in ways that have problematized what it's really about. I found this curious set of photographs from the magazine The Face from the year 2000, done by Miles Aldridge, in which he portrays these sleeping beauties who have been asleep for years, surrounded by flies who've inevitably come to sit around her because she's lying there rotting. Here's another one. And so we realize that actually some of these stories can be quite disturbing and therefore quite dark. The other thing about fairy tales is that we've inherited various plot tropes from them in all kinds of dramas that we might not think of as fairy tales. For example, something I've noticed is the idea of people leave a house or a castle, so a kind of man-made place, and go into the forest or into the garden and encounter nature in order to metaphorically understand their own true nature. And problems of the house or problems of the domestic situation come out literally into the open. So, for example, in Act 4 of Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro, the Countess Almaviva swaps clothes with her maid Susanna in order to smoke out the infidelity of the Count Almaviva, who we can see here. And this eventually leads to a particularly sublime moment when the Count kneels and asks for forgiveness from the Countess, because everything in the garden is kind of real and truthful, and therefore the Count can do nothing but surrender. In fairy tales, we also see this trope. So, for example, Hansel and Gretel, their fate in life, we could say, is to be saved. And so in order to be found, they have to be lost in the first place. So they go out into the woods, they encounter the natural, and then in time, the supernatural. And so the story goes on its way. We also have American versions of fairy tales where similar kinds of things happen. So Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz wanders off and finds these friends, and they all go down the yellow brick road and end up in the woods where they encounter potentially lions and tigers and bears, oh my. And the lion fantasizes of being king of the forest, so we can see that this is another familiar trope. And by the 1980s, Stephen Sondheim rather cleverly combined, with the help of his librettist James Lapine, various different fairy stories where all the different characters that we would recognize, whether it's Red Riding Hood or Cinderella, all kind of come together in one story. But in order to do this, they have to go into the woods, get a bit lost, and then eventually find out the truth about themselves. And this compulsion to go into the woods is depicted in the title song, Into the Woods. Little Red Riding Hood sings, "Into the woods, it's time, and so I must begin my journey." It's an imperative for fairy tale characters. For William Shakespeare, the forest might have signified the Forest of Arden, the real one, which of course he memorialized in As You Like It. But for today, we're thinking about a different Shakespeare forest, the one that forms the setting of the fairyland of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Now, this play is a little bit complicated to communicate what it's about, so pity the poor musicologist trying to do this. But there are three groups of characters in this play. The first is the Athenians of the court, led by the Duke Theseus, who is betrothed to Hippolyta, who is the queen of the Amazons. And Theseus is a bit fed up because it's still several days before they're going to get married. And she's saying, don't worry, it'll all seem like a dream, which immediately casts this question of, is the whole thing dreamed or real? And then there are two sets of lovers, Helena and Demetrius, Hermia and Lysander. And at various points in the plot, because of the interference of the fairies, there's kind of swapping going on. And the people that their parents want them to marry are different from the people that they want to marry. and then the fairies get involved, and it gets very complicated. Then we have the rude mechanicals, who are a group of workers, so they're very earthbound, so they're coming up from the bottom there, and they decide to get together and stage a play based on the classical Greek story of Pyramus and Thisbe, and they do this for the wedding of Theseus and Hippolyta. And the leading character amongst them is Bottom the Weaver, who's such a ham that he wants to play almost all the characters. Then we have the fairies, who are ruled by Queen Titania and King Oberon. And the other key character amongst them is Puck, who is kind of Oberon's sidekick. And Oberon and Puck are the two characters who wander through other elements of the plot and cause a lot of trouble for everyone else. It's a very clever story, and one of the clever things that Shakespeare does with this is to bring together sources from lots of different stories that have nothing to do with one another and stick them all together, and people wander through kind of each other's stories in rather a clever way. So, for example, Theseus's story has elements of Chaucer and Plutarch about it. The Pyramus and Thisbe tale comes from Ovid. Oberon was a familiar fairy character that Shakespeare actually acted in a version of the source text for Oberon's character. And then Puck was another well-known mythological character who is mentioned in Reginald Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft, which was a book that he wrote to prove that witchcraft didn't exist, but the reference to this character, who's also known as Robin Goodfellow, but we won't get into that today. But the reference to him makes it clear that this is another person that was known about. And finally, we have the story of the Golden Ass, whereby Queen Titania of the Fairies falls in love with Bottom the Weaver, who has adopted the appearance of an ass's head. And for the purposes of today, since we're interested in fairies, we're mainly interested in these three bits of story. Now, the sophistication of all of this, which is quite brilliant, has led to so many superlatives about this play that at times it can be difficult to represent its quite brilliant texture. So, for example, there's a famous essay by Algernon Swinburne about it, and he says it's outside as well as above all possible imaginative criticism. And he basically says it's the best thing ever written, which is perhaps going a bit too far. And when we read this kind of thing about it, we kind of forget that, for example, the story of Titania and Bottom has aspects of a kind of Beauty and the Beast story about it, which are apparent when we look at visual art inspired by those plot elements. The other thing that Dame Judi Dench rather helpfully reminds us is that actually when acting these characters, particularly the fairies, it's important to try and convey something human so that it means something to the audience, because what do we really know of fairies unless they're expressing something that we might recognize? So she says that the job of the actor is to find the humanity in Titania and Oberon. And she points out that at the beginning of the play, when we first encounter them, they are two married people having a blazing row. What could be more human than that? So in order to understand what all of this is about, we're going to hear an excerpt from their first conversation performed by our distinguished actors.
Ill met by moonlight, proud Titania.
What? Jealous Oberon? Fairy, skip hence. I have forsworn his bed and company.
Tarry, rash wanton. Am not I thy lord?
Then I must be thy lady. But I know when thou hast stolen away from fairyland and in the shape of Corin sat all day, playing on pipes of corn and versing love to amorous Philida. Why art thou here, come from the farthest steep of India, but that forsooth the bouncing Amazon, your buskined mistress and your warrior love, to Theseus must be wedded, and you come to give their bed joy and prosperity.
How canst thou thus for shame, Titania, glance at my credit with Hippolyta, knowing I know thy love to Theseus? Didst not thou lead him through the glimmering night from Periguna, whom he ravisheth, and make him with fair Aegials break his faith with Ariadne and Antiope?
These are the forgeries of jealousy, and never since the Midsummer spring met we on hill, in dale, forest, or mead, by paved fountain or by rushy brook, or in the beached marchant of the sea, to dance our ringlets to the whistling wind, but with thy brawls thou hast disturbed our sport. Therefore, the winds, piping to us in vain, as in revenge, have sucked up from the sea contagious fogs, which, falling in the land, hath every pelting river made so proud that they have overborne their continents. The ox hath therefore stretched his yoke in vain, the ploughman lost his sweat, and the green corn hath rotted ere his youth attained a beard. The fold stands empty in the drowned field, and crows are fatted with the Murrian flock. The 9 men's morris is filled up with mud, and the quaint mazes in the wanton green, for lack of tread, are undistinguishable. The human mortals want their winter here. No night is now with him or carol blessed. Therefore the moon, the governess of floods, pale in her anger, washes all the air that rheumatic diseases do abound. And through this distemperature we see the seasons alter. Hoary-headed frosts fall in the fresh lap of the crimson rose, and on old Jaime's thin and icy crown an odorous chaplet of sweet summer buds is as in mockery set. The spring, the summer, the childing autumn, angry winter change their wonted liveries, and the mazed world by their increase now knows not which is which. And this same progeny of evils comes from our debate, from our dissension. We are their parents and original.
Do you amend it, then? It lies in you. Why should Titania cross her Oberon? I do but beg a little changeling boy to be my henchman.
Oh, set your heart at rest. The fairy land buys not the child of me. His mother was a votress of my order, and in the spiced Indian air by night full often has she gossiped by my side and sat with me on Neptune's yellow sands, marking the embarked traders on the flood, when we have laughed to see the sails conceive and grow big-bellied with the wanton wind, which she, with pretty and with swimming gait, following her womb then rich with my young squire, would imitate, and sail upon the land to fetch me trifles, and return again as from a voyage rich with merchandise. But she, being mortal, of that boy did die, and for her sake do I rear up her boy, and for her sake I will not part with him.
How long within this wood intend you stay?
Perchance till after Theseus' wedding day. If you will patiently dance in our round and see our moonlight revels, go with us. If not, shun me, and I will spare your haunt.
Give me that boy, and I will go with thee.
Not for thy fairy kingdom. Fairies, away! We shall chide downright if I longer stay.
Well, go thy way. Thou shalt not from this grove, till I torment thee for this injury.
So what we're understanding from this is not only that they're angry with each other, but is about something very specific, which is this changeling boy that Oberon desires, but who is the child of one of Titania's followers, and therefore they're kind of rowing over the boy. Sarah, you appeared in a very famous production of this play in 1970. I've got the poster up here from the Royal Shakespeare Company, directed by Peter Brook, and there's a tiny bit of footage. We're not going to hear what's being said, but we can see you about to take flight on your feather. this production is mentioned in many Shakespearean texts, if you like, as being the most important production of the play of the last 50 or 60 years, a production that changed things. What kind of thing was it about it that was so striking? What was it that made people say, gosh, that's different?
Well, I suppose it had always been presented very much in a very traditional way, much as you were describing the plot with all of those different factions. And what you saw when you walked into the auditorium was this white box, and all of the accoutrements that were going to be used in the production. There were trapezes, and there were stilts, and there was this red feather, which Titania was to float on, were there for the audience to see. It was bright, bright, bright light. There was no change of the light at all. So it was a shock, in a sense. It was completely different from anything that had ever been seen before. And it was, in a way, I suppose in a way it must have seemed unmagical, but it became magical simply because of the way in which that white box was inhabited. And interestingly, Peter Brook had a feeling that the whole sentiment of love is maybe more easily expressed through song, through the sung notes than speech. And unless you've got a really beautiful Welsh accent, it's quite hard to extend a vowel sound. So he encouraged all of us to sing. So actually, I'm not sure whether the boys sang, but certainly Hermia and Helena sang. I sang. And so all of that was very unusual as well. And of course, he was very cheeky because he did at the end of he made his end of his first act was the celebration of Bottom with this, well, we didn't have a head, we had a sort of a hat with horns, and then, yes, look, you can see there he's got, not horns, ears, sorry, and this wonderful nose. That's David Waller, the great David Waller. And these wonderful boots that he had on, so they were like sort of great hoofs, you know. And then he was lifted, and there are the lovers hanging there, the magic having been put on their eyes. Oh. And Hugh Keys-Byrne is coming out of that door there. Now I've completely lost my train of thought.
But there is a sense that the production didn't need to be literal, so we didn't need to see sort of woods as we would know them, but that the story is being...
Absolutely not, yes. And the only time that the lighting actually changed was right at the end for the play within the play. And so for the play within the play, we did actually put on very lush, rich velvet costumes. And the other thing that has to be said is that it wasn't the first time that Titania and Hippolyta, Oberon and Theseus had been played together, but it was the first time, I think, where they were played without any change of costume.
And what was the point being made?
What was the point that was being made?
Yes, by that.
Oh, there was the kind of the alter ego, really. You know, that Titania is Hippolyta, is Titania.
So the whole thing is the fantasy of human characters, in other words, that they want to
maybe
carry out these lives. Oh, maybe, okay. I think that's me putting my plates. Okay, but he's asking these sorts of questions by presenting the whole thing in quite a different way.
Maybe.
Okay. And Ian, you're currently appearing at the Globe.
That's right. Oh, yes. Oh, my goodness. There I am, with lovely blonde locks.
And so you're performing Twelfth Night in this space that Shakespeare might have been more familiar with. What is it like to perform with the audience in this?
I should say who he is. He's Andrew Aguchi.
Yeah, apologies.
In Twelfth Night.
They can, surely you can see the resemblance. It's an extraordinary space to play in. I've been fortunate to perform there once before in 2012 with Mark Rylance, who knows that space intimately and gave us a bit of a masterclass in how to use that very big stage, and to accept that because you're sort of surrounded by the audience on pretty much three sides, that you're nearly always going to have your back to someone. And as long as you keep sort of things moving and keep it fluid, then that's okay, and the audience will accept that, because at some point they get to see your front as well. But it's, from my experience, the exchange between the actor and the audience is something really quite special, and I've never really experienced it in any other space. There's something quite magical that goes on there, and I think particularly when you're saying Shakespeare's lines, there's so many of them seem to resonate so much more in that space because they were written for that space. And so you do often get quite an extraordinary atmosphere between performers and audience that's not always, but it feels a little bit separate in other theatres, because obviously the house lights go down and you can't see people's faces. And
Yes, I was wondering about sort of transforming into a character. I mean, not being of your world, I have no idea how all this works anyway, but I was very struck by this photograph. I wasn't expecting to find it, and it sort of feels like they're there with you and you're there with them. So how do you become Andrew Aguecheek when it's sort of, the light is on them because the theatre is open at the top?
Yeah. Well, I think it's one of the great examples of an audience suspension of disbelief, because there's an unspoken agreement from the minute you walk out on that stage, even though you can see every single face. And unfortunately, sod's law is that whenever you look out, it will hit the person who's in mid-yawn or sort of checking their watch or something like that. But because you have that literal connection with the audience, you get a sense of the fact that they're instantly buying into the world of, in this case, of Illyria, and
Yes.
they're there, and there's no negotiation required. I think
Right.
it's
Interesting.
very immediate and really quite special.
And very quickly, Nathan, so we're going to talk about your singing voice later, but just as a general point, we are doing 4 vocal items later in the lecture. One is Purcell, one is Tippett, one is Britten, and the other is Smith. So we've got music of the 17th, 18th, and 20th centuries, and from different kind of genre, because we've got semi-operas, we've got incidental music for plays, art song. In terms of dealing with your voice as a classical singer across these things, is there something different about the way you approach it when you're actually playing a character in a theatre work versus in the concert form?
Yeah, and in a way that might be unexpected. I think often in singing instruction, we talk in terms of percentages between balance between music and words. And actually, in opera, which you might expect to be the most character committed, actually it's more like 90% music, 10% words. And I think that's because of the history of opera. It's about exporting the expressive parameters into the music that's given to you, and also to the music that's not given to you, to the orchestra, to the accompaniment, and things like that. So your job as an opera singer is more or less to make beautiful noises and trust that the expression of meaning will be taken care of by the orchestration, by the fact that you can move, the fact that you can act, the fact that you're wearing a costume, all those things. Whereas in song, and we'll hear a little bit of song and from the 20th century and song from the 17th century as well, 18th century rather, it's actually much more driven by color. So you're encouraged, or you're freed really, to make sounds that might be a little bit ugly, or sounds that might be a little bit differently produced, that won't carry as well, because the venues that you'll be performing in are usually a little bit smaller, so you don't need to be an efficient noise machine. But also there's something a bit more immediately communicative, where some of that expression, because on the whole you'll be generating characters instantly for the duration of a 2-minute song, and then you might be onto a completely different composer, different character. You have to play with everything you've got, including the way you produce your voice. So yeah, and we'll hear that whole variety in these 4 items.
Splendid, thank you very much. Well, I could chat with you through all night, but on with the lecture. So A Midsummer Night's Dream has a particular legacy in music in that it has inspired many composers to write music based on the plot or just elements of the plot. And here are just a few of them. We can see there's Mendelssohn and Britten, there's Purcell, there's Elvis Costello, there's even Vaughan Williams. And so we can see across the centuries, people have wanted to write music based on this play. And I think there's a couple of different reasons why this is the case. One of them is, on one level, the plot moves from disharmony to harmony. There's something musical about the logic of that. The whole thing starts in a kind of chaotic, tense way, and through their adventures in the forest, they eventually reach harmony, which is kind of doubled down on or tripled down on because there are 3 weddings in the final act, which is a lot of harmony being reinforced at the end. And then the other thing, quite simply, which goes back to our Tinkerbell example at the beginning, is that the fairies are inherently musical, and it seems to me that Titania in particular is a very musical character. So here are a couple of very short excerpts of Titania responding to or demanding music from people. So if we may hear the first example, this is Titania asking her fairy followers to sing for her.
Come. Now, a roundel and a fairy song. Then, for the 3rd part of a minute hence, some to kill cankers in the muskrose buds, some war with rear mice for their leathern wings to make my small elves' coats, and some keep back the clamorous owl that nightly hoots and wonders at our quaint spirits. Sing me now asleep, then to your offices, and let me rest.
And you can see that she's demanding that they sing to her, and they do so. And there's a moment of music written into the play, although the music that appears in the original production of the play is lost, sadly. And then another example is in Act 3. So Titania has encountered Bottom, and she not only immediately falls in love with him because she's had this potion given to her, and therefore just the sight of him makes her fall in love with him, but she also hears him singing, and she responds in this way.
I pray thee, gentle mortal, sing again. Mine ear is much enamoured of thy note, so is mine eye enthralled to thy shape, and thy fair virtue's force perforce doth move me on the first view to say, to swear, I love thee.
So you see, she's very turned on by the singing. There we go. Music has also played a particular role in the reception of the play, and this is something that we have to sketch out quite briefly across the centuries. And I was hoping to be able to show you some items that actually belong to Gresham College that help us to do this, because we have, for example, a songbook in the autograph hand of Henry Purcell, including 6 numbers from the Fairy Queen, and it belongs to the college. And so I had this great idea that we should pop along and bring it, and I could show it to you, and everyone could file past and have a look. And then we discovered it's worth £100,000. And we don't love you that much. So we meant to make a little video for you of this hidden secret. And I discovered in actual fact that not only is this library, which is hosted at the Guildhall Library these days and has been since 1958, not only does the library have that very special piece, but it also has a number of different, very rare musical scores that are inspired by A Midsummer Night's Dream. So let's take a look. I've come here to the City of London to show you a hidden gem. It's the Gresham Music Library. Starting in 1838, the then Professor of Music, Edward Taylor, appealed to the general public to help him set up a library of important musical scores that would be available to the general public to consult. And it includes everything from early English music through to the important classical music of Europe of the day. And as we look through the shelves, we can see a vast collection of scores by Handel, beautiful bound volumes of the music of Purcell, some works of Mozart, and there's a particular strength in 18th and 17th century Italian vocal works. And the idea was that people would donate scores that they cared about, and they would be available to the general public to consult. And right up to this day, thanks to the Guildhall, the general public can continue to come and see these remarkable scores. We can see the importance of the collection in a number of rare, very old manuscripts. For example, here we have a bound collection of the composer John Blow's choral music. And in this instance, on this page, I've opened the anthem I Was Glad, which he wrote for the opening of St. Paul's in 1697. Another important volume from the collection is this early copy of Tallis's Spem and Allium in 40 parts. We can see Tallis's autograph on the opening page there, and as we turn the pages, we can see each of the 40 parts of the work which he composed, going right to the end of the manuscript. This is the second or third copy, one of the earliest versions of this really important piece of music. Another treasure of the collection is some social history, and specifically all of these notebooks which document the lectures given by one of the professors of music at Gresham, Richard John Samuel Stevens, and he was the Gresham Professor of Music from 1801 to 1835. And if we look at his very first lecture, which he gave in 1801, we can see what he's aiming to do in the series. He says, "Since the commencement of my reading lectures on music as the Gresham Professor, I have resolved to enliven my discourses with matter of entertainment." And so he's describing in this lecture what the aim of his lecture series is going to be, and it goes on for pages and pages, and we can see that there are notebooks documenting all the lectures he gave every year. Pertinent to my lecture on Shakespeare's musical Fairies is this volume of vocal works by Stevens, which was presented to the college a year after his death in the inaugural month of the Gresham Music Library, May 1838. And we can see that many of the items in the volume are settings of Shakespeare, and specific to my lecture are two settings of passages from A Midsummer Night's Dream. First of all, we have Ye Spotted Snakes, which is a glee for four voices, and it's signed in the top right-hand corner by Edward Taylor himself. So we can see that he actually consulted this score and looked at this page. And then later on, we have another setting of Midsummer Night's Dream. Now the hungry lion roars and howling wolves behold the moon. This item, although it's not a setting of Shakespeare, is obviously connected to the lecture topic, because we can see it's an opera called Oberon, or the Elf King's Oath. And so this is another manifestation of the Oberon myth. And it's an opera written by Carl Maria von Weber, especially for London. It was premiered in 1826, so 199 years ago, at the Theatre Royal Covent Garden, and it was Weber's final work. But perhaps the crown jewel of the collection, certainly as far as this topic is concerned, is this remarkable songbook in the hand of Henry Purcell from the 1690s. So it's over 300 years old. And remarkably, the first few numbers in the piece are arias from The Fairy Queen, Purcell's adaptation of A Midsummer Night's Dream, in operatic form. So we can see here, "Come all ye songsters of the sky," and then later on, as we turn the pages, we can see "Thrice happy lovers," and further in the manuscript we can see another piece, "Now the night is chased away, all salute and rise," and down here there's reference to the birthday of King Oberon, a character that we're familiar with by now. So this songbook would have been used probably by Purcell in lessons or perhaps for concerts. They're not the first time he wrote out these pieces, and it's a kind of compilation of great vocal works from different times that he wrote. But a number of them are in keys that are different from the autograph manuscripts. So it shows that actually he was quite happy to hear his vocal music performed in different keys, which is interesting. And it's just remarkable to recognize that here at Gresham we have this historic document of the most important early English opera composer, Henry Purcell. It was very moving to turn the pages and see all of that in his handwriting, and I couldn't believe it when I discovered that the college actually owned this amazing document. The Fairy Queen is one of the two most famous adaptations of the play into operatic form. It was written in 1692, and a year later he added a whole act of music. And it was a very particular kind of form that was responding to a particular historical moment. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 led to the reopening of public theatres, but theatre owners and directors would revisit old texts to bring them up to date in terms of the perceived taste of the day and also the perceived moral compass of the day. And one of the things that they did was to create this trendy thing called a semi-opera, which combined spoken text with extensive vocal and instrumental music. But it didn't really work out very well. The Fairy Queen is one of the few famous examples, and we can see that this famous book from 1729 talks about how this came about. A guy called Thomas Betterton was the chief kind of producer of these semi-operas, and they had a particular form, for they consisted of half music and half drama, as Roger North tells us. But actually, half of the audience came for the music and didn't want to hear all of this talking, and the other half felt the other way round. So it didn't really go down all of that well. And there were two casts, so it was also extremely expensive to put on. There was a cast of actors who performed an edited version of Shakespeare's text, and then there were the singers who did standalone vocal numbers that had really nothing to do with the story most of the time. And Purcell allocates most of the vocal numbers to fairies or supernatural or allegorical characters and just sticks them at the ends of acts of the play or beginnings of the play. But in Act 2, there's a fascinating sequence when the section of Titania going to sleep that we just heard actually was responded to in musical form by the composer. And so there was an extended scene involving these four characters of night, mystery, secrecy, and sleep, which covered Titania's descent into sleep and expanded the focus on the fairy world. And so we're now going to perform Secrecy's aria from the Fairy Queen, which is called One Charming Night. And as you'll hear, it's written for countertenor. I should say that Purcell was a countertenor. Nathan, lovely job. So tell me, what is a countertenor? I mean, how does this happen?
So I won't bore you with all the details because it has historically been a matter of some debate. But the easiest way of defining it is a man who's been through androgenic puberty. So as you can hear from my speaking voice, speaks as a bass or a baritone or a tenor, but sings high, sings an alto part. So it's just a male alto. And it has a good deal of history, especially in this country. In Italy, of course, in the 16th and 17th, and to a certain extent the 18th and even 19th centuries, they favoured castrati. So those were boys that were castrated before they at least finished, but if not started, puberty, and so retained their unchanged voices. But this never was fashionable in England and was frowned upon. And so there's always been a tradition of countertenors in this country, including by Henry Purcell, who, as you mentioned, was one. It's slightly complicated because it definitely meant something different in Purcell's time. It meant someone who was essentially a tenor, but could sing very, very high by singing in falsetto, because it wasn't fashionable to sing high in full, what we call chest voice, until much later on. In fact, there's a diary entry when the first high C was done in chest voice in a Donizetti aria, and this kind of took the country by storm, because that was seen as kind of uncouth. But yeah, so that would have been sung by a countertenor.
But there would have been performances, were there not, where they imported castrati from Italy, performing alongside
Absolutely.
countertenors. This is something I struggle to get my...
Yeah, so Italian countertenors were fashionable in Italian opera. We're going to hear the next piece. The piece that I will sing was actually sung by a boy, but had Gaetano Guadagni sing it, who was a very fashionable countertenor towards the end of Handel's career. In fact, Handel rewrote some of his music specifically for Guadagni. So the second performance of the Messiah, he was so taken by Guadagni's low notes that he wrote the famous bit for He's Like a Refiner's Fire. That was for Guadagni, the mezzo-soprano castrato. Before that, it was kind of quite a boring recitative. And Guadagni was, going back to what you said about how willing these composers were to change their scores, he rescored bits of Samson, bits of Judas Maccabeus, for Guadagni's voice.
And very quickly, what sort of associations were there with countertenors? Because I'm struck by the fact that the message of this aria that you've just sung, one charming night gives more delight than 100 lucky days, words to live by, is that allocated to
Yeah, no, absolutely. So
a countertenor for a reason?
we often think that part is a different country, they do things differently, that the people in the 17th, 16th, 18th centuries were different species of people, but they weren't. Men singing high was always unusual. And so they often played castrati, countertenors, however you dice it. They would have played gods, fairies, or often heroes, someone specifically of a different sort of birth, someone exceptional. And so their subject matter would have either been heroic, supernatural, or, as we see, the overtly sexual, because there was seen as something disembodied, something unusual about that vocal production.
Excellent. So something that I found in the Gresham Music Library, which I wasn't expecting to find, was this opera called The Fairies, which is another adaptation of A Midsummer Night's Dream. The composer was a guy called John Christopher Smith, who was one of Handel's students and became his amanuensis, so he would have copied out some of the scores for the instrumentalists to perform from. And the libretto was by David Garrick, of all people, the great famous Shakespearean actor. But the text of the dream is messed around with a great deal. So, for example, he imports song texts from several other Shakespearean plays, including Sigh No More from Much Ado About Nothing, which really has no business being in this piece. But we did find this cute little aria, which is very short, so we thought we'd do it, which is Oberon casting his spell through the potion on Demetrius. So this is from Act 3, Scene 2.
the Venus of the sky. When thou wakest, if she be by, beg of her for remedy, for remedy. Beg of her for remedy.
So Oberon starts to feel a bit sorry for having tricked Titania, and once he manages to swipe the changeling child that he decides to uncast the spell and let poor Titania go. So let's hear how that works.
Her dotage now I do begin to pity. For meeting her of late behind the wood, seeking sweet favours for this hateful fool, I did upbraid her and fall out with her. For she his hairy temples then had rounded with coronet of fresh and fragrant flowers, and that same dew which sometime on the buds was wont to swell like round and orient pearls, stood now within the pretty floweret's eyes like tears that did their own disgrace bewail. When I had at my pleasure taunted her, and she in mild terms begged my patience, I then did ask of her changeling child, which straight she gave me, and her fairies sent to bear him to my bower in fairyland. And now I have the boy, I will undo this hateful imperfection of her eyes. And gentle Puck, take this transformed scalp from off the head of this Athenian swain, that he, awaking when the other do, may all to Athens back again repair, and think no more of this night's accidents, but as the fierce vexation of a dream. But first, I will release the fairy queen. Be as thou wast wont to be, see as thou wast wont to see. Dian's bud o'er Cupid's flower hath such force and blessed power. Now, my Titania, wake you, my sweet queen.
Oh, my Oberon, what visions have I seen? Methought I was enamored of an ass.
There lies your love.
How came these things to pass? Oh, how mine eyes do loathe his visage now.
Silence a while. Robin, take off this head. Titania, music call, and strike more dead than common sleep of all these five the sense.
Music, oh, music, such as charmeth sleep.
Come, my queen, take hands with me, and rock the ground whereon these sleepers be. Now thou and I are new in amity, and will tomorrow night solemnly dance in Duke Theseus' house triumphantly, and bless it to all fair prosperity. There shall the pairs of faithful lovers be wedded with Theseus all in jollity. Then, my queen, in silence sad, trip we after night's shade. We the globe can compass soon, swifter than the wandering moon.
Come, my lord, and in our flight, tell me how I came this night that I sleeping here was found with these mortals on the ground.
By the 18th century, Shakespeare had become incredibly popular in Germany, surprisingly perhaps, to the extent that by the end of the 18th century, Schlegel described him as completely ours, and Schlegel was one of the two main translators of Shakespeare into German, a much admired translation. And someone that read this translation was a man called Felix Mendelssohn, one of the great composers of the day. At the age of 17, he wrote an overture inspired by A Midsummer Night's Dream, and it made his name. And it was so popular that in 1742, the King of Prussia asked him to expand it into incidental music, and that incidental music became the standard music performed alongside the play. But later in the 19th century, Richard Wagner wrote a dreadful text called Jewishness in Music, defining Mendelssohn as the epitome of trivial composition. And so Mendelssohn was incredibly under fire in the Third Reich during the 1930s. And so Goebbels demanded that Mendelssohn no longer be performed alongside Shakespeare, even though Shakespeare was still allowed to be performed because he was completely German, as we have seen. And one of the most notorious moments in music history was when, in 1939, Carl Orff, best known for writing Carmina Burana, wrote new incidental music for the play A Midsummer Night's Dream so that Mendelssohn's wouldn't be needed anymore. But the other thing that happened in this decade is that Erich Korngold, who was also driven away by the Third Reich, but still obviously very much alive, went to Hollywood, and the first assignment he was given was arranging Mendelssohn's music for a famous film that Warner Brothers produced based on A Midsummer Night's Dream, directed by Max Reinhardt, also a Jewish artist from Vienna. And we can see that Korngold was even part of the trailer for the film because it was such a big deal to have him part of it. And something that I found ironic is that actually by the time he'd adapted Mendelssohn using kind of more romantic orchestration techniques, Mendelssohn started to sound a bit like Wagner, especially when added to these visuals. So it's a bit of a strange business culturally. The last adaptation that we're going to look at is Benjamin Britten's, and it seems to me that something that Britten picked up on, and the reason why he wanted to adapt the play into an opera, was perhaps his attraction to the fact that Oberon is presented as having fluid sexuality. We can see various productions depict Oberon and Puck, for example, in slightly affectionate stances. Here's another one, Adrian Noble with Alex Jennings from the 1990s, and Oberon is telling Puck to go and get the magic juice so that they can start spreading chaos with the potion, and Puck says yes with a kiss. So we can see that the whole thing becomes rather erotic, on top of the fact that Oberon is definitely very interested in the changeling child. So Britten and Piers, who were partners, Piers being a tenor, a major performer of the day, decided to do their own adaptation for the Aldborough Festival in 1960, but they decided that all of the business in Athens wasn't that interesting. So they began in the fairy kingdom, which we can see here, and the very beginning of the opera is described in this way by the queer academic Philip Brett. He says, "We open at once into a world of dreams, which is the real world of the opera. A world of possibilities, the world of the libido." So it's highly sexualized. And this is depicted in very low, murky music, which then forms the basis of Oberon's aria. Unusually, Britten wrote an article in The Observer ahead of the premiere of the opera. He didn't normally comment on his new pieces before they'd been heard, and he admitted that the opera was a bit strange in places, that his fairies weren't innocent, but then he thought that Shakespeare's fairies weren't as innocent as they were usually portrayed either. He thought that they were rather sharp people and are given rather odd poetry to speak about spotted snakes with double tongue, for example, and they are the guards to Titania, and the spirit world contains bad as well as good. And to depict the dangerous attraction of Oberon, Britten turned to one of his passions, which was the music of Henry Purcell, and so decided to allocate the role of Oberon to a countertenor, and wrote to the countertenor Alfred Deller, who had no experience of being on the stage at all. He was a concert artist, and said, "How do you feel about being Oberon?" And he was a bit shocked because he thought, well, I'm not really an opera singer. And at that point, there wasn't really the repertoire or the sense of a career for being an opera singer countertenor on the stage. But Piers was insistent, and he says, "I think that you'll be great. Your height and presence will be absolutely right, and so will your beard." And so now we're going to hear Oberon's aria, and you'll hear, first of all, that the harmonies are very much inspired by Britten's affection for gamelan music. And the other thing is that the orchestration, if we could hear it, I'm going to try and reproduce it, uses things like the harp, the Celesta, again, the harpsichord, very strange effects going on in the orchestra to bring the fairy world to life. So here we go.
Thou shalt know the man by the Athenian garments he hath on.
And so we come to the end of the story, and someone that seemed to have a real insight into it was G.K. Chesterton of Father Brown fame, who in 1905 wrote this essay about Shakespeare and explained what's interesting about the end of the play that kind of reframes everything that we've seen. And he says, we've had these 3 weddings and all the humans leave, and you think that the story is over, and then comes the faint sound of little feet, and for a moment, as it were, the elves look into the house, asking which is the reality. Suppose we are the realities, and they are the shadows. And that really explains what the whole thing has been about, and why music is part of the whole story. It's because music provides this liminal space where we can slip between what might be real and what might be fantastical. Thank you.